On the morning of May 16, 2008, in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Noida, something horrific unfolded behind the closed doors of the Talwar household. It started like any other day, but no one could have predicted the nightmare that would soon shake this family to its core. At 6:30 a.m., Rajesh Talwar, a dentist, woke up. His wife Nupur Talwar was already in the kitchen. They were both early risers, as most professionals are. Their 14-year-old daughter, Aarushi Talwar, should have been getting ready for school, but she wasn't in her room. Rajesh checked Arushi's room, expecting to see her getting ready for the day. Instead, what he saw was a sight that no father should ever have to witness. Aarushi was lying motionless on her bed, her throat slit, the sheets soaked with blood. The first instinct of any parent would be to rush to their child, to hold them, to try and bring them back. But for Rajesh, all he could do was scream, "Nupur." Rushed to the scene, but there was nothing they could do. Aarushi was gone. Rajesh called the police. The family's maid, who arrived soon after, discovered that the door to Arushi's room had been locked from the inside. The police arrived quickly, taking in the scene. Everything was suspicious. Everything was wrong. The first thought was that this was a random attack, that someone had broken into their house and murdered Aarushi in the middle of the night. But nothing else seemed to add up. The room didn't look disturbed, and there were no signs of forced entry. The police combed the house searching for answers, but they were left with more questions than solutions. There was no sign of struggle. There were no signs of robbery. Nothing seemed to make sense. The only thing they could confirm was the horror of the crime, a young girl brutally murdered in her own home. As the police began their investigation, the family continued to deal with the shock of their loss. Who could do such a thing? Why would anyone hurt their daughter? The question that haunted Rajesh and Nupur, the question that the police were now tasked with answering was, who could have killed Aarushi? And then, just when it seemed like they had no answers, another blow came to the family. The domestic help, Hemraj Banjade, was missing. He was the last person who had been seen at the house the previous evening, and he had vanished without a trace. At first, the police suspected that he might have been the perpetrator, but that theory didn't sit well with the Talwars. Hemraj had been working for them for months. He was a trusted part of their household. Could he really be the killer? Could he really have murdered Aarushi? The morning dragged on. Hours passed. The family's grief deepened with each moment, and the authorities struggled to piece together what had happened. The next breakthrough came when the police, after searching the house and surrounding areas, made a chilling discovery. They found Hemraj's body. But it wasn't in the house, it was on the roof. How had Hemraj's body ended up there? Why had he been hidden? And why hadn't anyone heard anything? Hemraj's throat, too, had been slashed. Now, 2 lives had been taken in a single night. A double murder. But there were still more questions than answers. Was it a coincidence that Aarushi and Hemraj were both murdered in the same manner, at the same time? Was there a connection between the 2 deaths? Or was something more sinister at play? The police, unsure where to begin, were left grasping. At straws, Rajesh and Nupur, meanwhile, were consumed with grief and confusion. They were parents who had lost their daughter in the most brutal way imaginable, and now they were faced with the added nightmare of trying to understand how their domestic help could have been involved in something so violent. The tragedy was compounded by the sheer horror of the circumstances. As the day wore on, the police began to look at everything with fresh eyes. Was there something the Talwars weren't telling them? Had they been involved in this tragedy in some way? And why had Hemraj's body been found on the roof? That was something that didn't sit right with anyone. The authorities were left to wonder. Could it have been a robbery gone wrong? Could it have been a random attack by an outsider? Or, as the first theory seemed to suggest, was this something far more personal? Had the family been involved? But one thing became clear. The Talwars had no answers. They were as confused as everyone else. There was no explanation, no sense of logic to help guide the police investigation. Only more questions, more fear, and more suspicion. The police continued to search the Talwar residence for any signs of forced entry or anything that might point to a possible motive. But each new piece of evidence seemed to make things murkier. There were no clear fingerprints. There was no sign of a struggle. The locks were intact. It was a cold case before it had even really begun. Rajesh and Nupur continued to answer questions, their voices breaking, their eyes filled with the disbelief of a nightmare they couldn't wake from. How had this happened? And why? As the investigation stretched into the following days, the authorities began to entertain more difficult questions. Could this have been an inside job? Could the Talwars themselves have been involved? After all, what did the evidence point to? A family member, a domestic help who had been killed in a way that seemed far too deliberate to be a random act? Then, the suspicion started to shift. Could this be the result of something deeper? Something hidden behind the doors of this seemingly quiet family home? Could this have been a crime born of jealousy? Or a deeper motive? One thing was certain, this wasn't a simple case. It wasn't the kind of murder where the answer was clear from the start. No one knew who had done this, and no one could guess why. Days turned into weeks, and the police, still stumped, began to focus more heavily on the family. They questioned Rajesh and Nupur, searching for any sign that they might have known something they weren't saying. And the media, always hungry for the next sensational story, latched onto the case. The press had a field day, speculating on everything from family dynamics to secret affairs to hidden grudges. The Talwars, suddenly the focal point of public interest, found themselves not only dealing with the unbearable loss of their daughter, but also a growing sense of suspicion and mistrust from everyone around them. Every time they turned on the TV, it was there. The whispers, the accusations. Their private lives had been torn apart by a media frenzy, and their names were now forever linked to a crime that no one could explain. The truth, it seemed, was slipping further and further out of reach. But one thing was certain. Someone was responsible for this. Someone had killed Aarushi Talwar and Hemraj Banjade. But who? The case had only just begun, and already the road to the truth was becoming more twisted, more confusing, and far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The Talwars, now caught in the web of suspicion, could only wait as the investigation continued to unravel their lives. But would they ever find the answers they were searching for? Or would they too be swept up in the whirlwind of doubt and suspicion that seemed to surround them? And in the quiet of the Talwar home, one question echoed above all others. Who could have committed such a crime in their own house? And why? The first few days after the murders were filled with chaos. The police were scrambling to make sense of the scene. The Talwars were in a state of shock, and the media was already digging into every corner of the case, eager to speculate on what had happened inside the Talwar home. The initial theory was simple. It was assumed that Hemraj, the domestic help, had killed Aarushi in a fit of rage and then turned the knife on himself. After all, the evidence was vague. The lack of forced entry into the house suggested it might have been an inside job. The doors were locked from the inside. Nothing had been stolen. It seemed like a reasonable assumption, but as the investigation moved forward, things quickly became murky. The police couldn't find any solid evidence to support the theory that Hemraj had been the killer. There was no sign of him in Aarushi's room, no sign that he'd tried to rob her or even interact with her in any violent way. In fact, his body had been found in a place no one would have expected, the roof of the Talwar residence. If Hemraj had killed Aarushi, why hide his own body on the roof? Why would he go to such lengths? It didn't make sense. The police, now faced with contradictions, had no choice but to widen their investigation. Every possible lead was followed, but no answers came. The family was questioned, but the Talwars were adamant. They knew nothing of what had happened. They were as bewildered and broken as anyone else. It wasn't long before the police began to focus on the Talwars themselves. After all, who could be closer to Aarushi than her own parents? And who had the most to gain from her death? The evidence against them, though, was thin. There were no clear signs of a motive, there were no clear signs of guilt, but there was suspicion. And suspicion can be a powerful thing in the midst of an investigation. As the questioning continued, rumors began to swirl. Was there a dark secret hidden within the family? Was it possible that something had gone terribly wrong? Was this an act of passion, or was there something more sinister at play? The police turned their attention to Rajesh and Nupur. Were they hiding something? Did they know more than they were letting on? The Talwars were caught in a strange web. They were grieving the loss of their daughter, but now they were also being treated as suspects. Their world, already turned upside down by the tragedy, was now consumed by an even darker cloud of suspicion. The investigation hit a standstill. There was no clear physical evidence pointing to anyone. No fingerprints, no blood trails, no sign of forced entry. The house had been left almost pristine. The only things that had been disturbed were the lives of the Talwar family, shattered in an instant. But then came a startling revelation. A piece of evidence, small but significant, came to light. A cell phone. It was discovered that Rajesh Talwar had tried to make a phone call the night of Aarushi's murder. And what made this so interesting was that the call was placed to a number that was somehow linked to the case. Who was this person? And why had Rajesh contacted them at such a critical moment? This was just one more thread in the web of confusion and suspicion surrounding the Talwars. For the police, every new detail seemed to only add more layers of mystery, and they couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. Could the murder of Aarushi and Hemraj have been planned? Was there a deeper motive that no one was seeing? The Talwars, meanwhile, were struggling to keep their composure. They had not only lost their daughter in a horrific way, but now their names were being dragged through the mud. Their lives were being scrutinized by every corner of society, by everyone except those who were closest to them. The media frenzy was reaching a fever pitch. Headlines screamed accusations. The Talwars were guilty, they said, but there was no proof. The police, finding themselves in a race against time, decided to go back to the beginning. They combed through the house again, looking for any overlooked detail. And it was during this second sweep of the house that they found something disturbing, a blunt object, one that appeared to have been used to strike someone. Could this be the key to solving the case? Was this the weapon that had killed Aarushi or Hemraj? Or was it a red herring, an object planted to mislead the investigators? But no matter how much the police tried, they couldn't seem to get a solid lead. The Talwars were cooperative, answering questions, submitting to interviews. But it felt as though the walls were closing in on them. Their own daughter had been murdered, and yet they were being treated as suspects. Every theory raised seemed to complicate things further. Had Aarushi's death been the result of an affair gone wrong? Or had the parents become desperate and angry? Or was there someone else entirely? A stranger, an outsider, who had entered their home and murdered both Aarushi and Hemraj for reasons still unknown. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure on the Talwars grew. The media circus was relentless, the theories growing wilder by the day. The police, though still uncertain, were beginning to piece together a more sinister narrative. There were hints that the family was hiding something. But what could it be? Was the perfect family facade nothing more than a lie? Was there a hidden agenda that no one knew about? In the absence of concrete evidence, the case became a battleground for speculation. Some people whispered that the Talwars were involved in something they weren't admitting. Others believed that it was all a misunderstanding, that the true killer was someone else, someone who had slipped through the cracks of the investigation. The courtroom was now set to become the next stage in this unfolding tragedy. The evidence was still sketchy, the theories growing more convoluted, but one thing was clear. Someone had killed Aarushi Talwar and Hemraj Banjade, and that someone was yet to be identified. The family's life continued to fall apart. Rajesh and Nupur tried to maintain some sense of normalcy, but the investigation into their lives was suffocating. The public had turned on them. In their eyes, the Talwars were no longer grieving parents. They were the suspects. And for many, that was all the confirmation they needed. By now, the story of Aarushi's murder had captivated the nation. The press had already decided that the Talwars were guilty, and no amount of new evidence, no amount of defense from the family would change that narrative. People were convinced they knew the truth, and that truth was that the parents were responsible for their daughter's death. But the reality was far more complicated than the simple theories being thrown around. The truth wasn't clear. It wasn't easy to find. And the people who should have been offering the answers were now trapped in a system that was designed to find a scapegoat, not the real killer. The investigation continued. The search for answers became a search for someone to blame. And in the meantime, the Talwars could only sit and watch as their lives were torn apart. Their grief, once raw and uncontrollable, was now buried beneath layers of suspicion and doubt. The case was moving into darker waters, and with each passing day, it became harder to see a way out for the Talwars. They were being consumed by the investigation. The hope for justice was slipping away. The truth was still locked behind the walls of the Talwar household, and no one seemed to be getting any closer to breaking it open. What happened to Aarushi and Hemraj? Was the truth buried under the weight of a botched investigation, or was there a much darker secret yet to be revealed? The questions, like the bodies of the victims, piled up, and no one seemed to have any answers. As the investigation into the murders of Aarushi Talwar and Hemraj Banjade continued, the case seemed to be spiraling further out of control. The media circus, relentless from the start, only intensified. Public opinion was swayed, and the Talwars, already reeling from the loss of their daughter, were now facing the harsh glare of suspicion. The investigation had failed to provide any solid evidence, but the theory that Arushi's parents were involved had taken root. Months passed, and the case became one of the most talked about in India. The police were stuck in a loop of confusion, while the press painted a picture of guilt around the Talwars. There was one theory that stood out, one that made its way into the headlines day after day. The Talwars had murdered their daughter. But why? And how could this happen in a family so seemingly perfect? In the absence of concrete evidence, the police continued to piece together their case, desperately hoping that something would finally break. But as the media's scrutiny became unbearable, the focus shifted. It was no longer just about finding out who killed Aarushi. It had become about finding someone to blame. And as often happens in high-profile cases, when the investigation stalls, the search for answers often leads to convenient conclusions. By November 2010, after 2 years of investigation, the case finally made its way into the courtroom. Rajesh and Nupur Talwar, once respected members of the community, were now the prime suspects in the brutal murders of their daughter and their domestic help. The evidence against them was circumstantial at best, but the tide of public opinion had already turned. The stage was set for a trial that would captivate a nation. The court proceedings began, and what followed was an unfolding drama, complete with accusations, retracted confessions, and arguments over the mishandling of evidence. It was a legal battle that seemed destined to uncover the truth, but the deeper it went, the more complicated and fragmented it became. The case, initially filled with confusion and unanswered questions, soon became one of the most divisive in Indian legal history. On one side stood the prosecution, determined to prove that the Talwars were responsible for their daughter's death. On the other side stood the defense, insisting that the parents were innocent and that there was not enough evidence to convict them. But it wasn't just the evidence that was under scrutiny, it was the entire investigation. The prosecution was arguing that the Talwars had orchestrated the murders. The defense, however, pointed out glaring flaws in the investigation. The public had already made up its mind. The Talwars, they said, were guilty. The case was sensationalized by the media, with headlines that focused on the personal lives of the Talwars, their professional history, and any possible motives that could justify such an unimaginable crime. The media pushed the narrative that the Talwars had killed their daughter in cold blood, but the question remained, could they have done it? The trial brought with it a flood of allegations. The prosecution argued that Rajesh and Nupur were motivated by personal and familial disputes, that their marriage was troubled, and that they had something to hide. They pointed to a possible cover-up, suggesting that the couple had killed Aarushi in a fit of rage, possibly over her relationships or a perceived slight. The prosecution painted a picture of a family on the brink, the tensions between Aarushi and her parents finally reaching a breaking point. The defense, on the other hand, maintained that the police had mishandled the entire investigation. The evidence, they argued, was inconclusive at best. There were no forensic fingerprints on the murder weapon, no physical evidence linking the Talwars to the crime scene. In fact, the crime scene itself had been tampered with, which led the defense to argue that the police had rushed to judgment, without fully considering all the facts. The most significant development in the trial came when the prosecution introduced a so-called confession. The police claimed that Rajesh Talwar had confessed to the murder of his daughter, a confession that was retracted almost immediately. The defense seized on this as an example of police misconduct, claiming that the confession had been coerced. They argued that Rajesh had been under intense pressure, his grief twisted into something the authorities could use to build their case. The defense also pointed out that the confession was highly inconsistent and therefore could not be used as solid evidence in a court of law, but that didn't stop the media from latching onto it. The notion of a father killing his daughter was too sensational to ignore. The Talwars became pariahs, both in the courtroom and in the court of public opinion. It seemed as though everyone had already convicted them, long before the final verdict. Meanwhile, the public's obsession with the case had reached fever pitch. There was speculation about the family's wealth, their professional lives, and any personal animosities that might have been simmering beneath the surface. The prosecution argued that the Talwars' wealth and lifestyle had created a toxic dynamic in the household. They pointed to the strained relationships between Aarushi and her parents, suggesting that these tensions might have led to the horrific crime. The defense, however, tried to redirect the focus back to the critical question: who killed Aarushi and Hemraj? The evidence against the Talwars was far from solid, they argued, and the investigation had been marred by mistakes. The prosecution's theory of a family murder was speculative at best, and the Talwars should not be convicted based on conjecture and media influence. But with each passing day, the trial grew more contentious. The case seemed less about finding the truth and more about assigning blame. And as the media continued to fan the flames of suspicion, the courtroom drama unfolded like a tragic play, with the Talwars caught in the middle, trying to defend themselves from accusations they still couldn't fully understand. As the trial dragged on, it became clear that this was not a simple case of murder. It was a story of family secrets, media frenzy, and legal missteps. The prosecution had its theory, the defense had its doubts, but the truth was nowhere to be found. And in the midst of it all, the Talwars' lives had been turned upside down. It was in 2013 that the verdict finally came. After years of intense scrutiny, the judge sentenced Rajesh and Nupur Talwar to life imprisonment for the murders of their daughter and their domestic help. The prosecution's theory had prevailed, and the Talwars were officially convicted of murder. But even then, the questions didn't stop. The verdict, while shocking to some, was met with skepticism by many. Was this really justice, or had the case been mishandled from the start? Was the conviction the result of a flawed investigation, a rushed trial, and the overwhelming influence of public opinion? The conviction seemed to satisfy many, but for others, it raised more doubts. The trial had been long and exhausting. The media had already passed judgment. The nation had already formed its opinion. But was the truth really out there? And if so, could the Talwars truly be guilty? The conviction, however, was not the final chapter. In 2017, after years of legal battles, the Allahabad High Court overturned the Talwars' conviction. The court found that the prosecution had failed to present adequate evidence to support the guilty verdict. The Talwars were acquitted, but the damage was already done. The case that had once seemed like a straightforward tragedy had turned into an enduring mystery, one that still haunts the Indian public. The questions surrounding Aarushi's death and the murder of Hemraj remain unanswered. Who killed them? What really happened that night? The case of Aarushi Talwar, a story of loss, suspicion, and a deeply flawed investigation, remains a tragic testament to the complexities of seeking justice. For Rajesh and Nupur Talwar, the acquittal was a bittersweet moment, a hard-earned victory that could never undo the harm done to their family. The public's perception of them had already been shaped. In the end, the truth remained elusive, and so the mystery of Aarushi Talwar's death endures. The trial was over. The verdicts had been delivered. But for the Talwar family, the long ordeal was far from over. Rajesh and Nupur Talwar had been acquitted, but what had they truly won? The years they spent fighting accusations, dealing with public scorn and surviving a media frenzy had left their lives irreparably shattered. Their daughter Aarushi was still gone. Hemraj was still dead. And the mystery of who had actually murdered them remained unsolved. The acquittal, while a moment of justice for the Talwars, didn't bring closure. It didn't bring back Aarushi. It didn't undo the public shame, the whispers, the assumptions. It didn't erase the years spent in a courtroom fighting for their innocence in a system that had already labeled them guilty. The legal battles had been won, but the emotional scars would never fade. For the Talwars, the question remained: who killed Aarushi and Hemraj? The most fundamental question of all had never been answered. And so, as the dust settled, the case of Arushi's murder lingered in the air like an unsolved riddle. Despite the acquittal, the mystery continued to haunt the nation. With no clear answers, the case became a symbol of what happens when justice is mishandled, when investigation and media coverage collide, and when public opinion becomes as powerful as the law. The impact of the case was felt far beyond the Talwar family. The media had been relentless, the police had been inept, and the public had been quick to judge. In the aftermath, it became clear just how deeply the case had affected Indian society. Arushi's murder was not just a tragedy. It had become a spectacle, a story with so many twists and turns that it was impossible to ignore. And yet, after all the years of media coverage, interviews, theories, and courtroom drama, the truth had never come to light. In the years following the acquittal, the Talwars tried to rebuild their lives. They returned to their home in Noida, but it was no longer the same. The house, once a place of normalcy and comfort, had become a symbol of all they had lost. Every room held memories of their daughter, memories that were now tainted by the pain of her death and the injustice they had faced. They tried to move on, but how could they when the wound was so deep? Rajesh, a respected dentist, had lost his practice during the trial. His career, once flourishing, was now in ruins. Nupur, a teacher, faced similar struggles. Their names had been dragged through the mud. Their professional lives had been destroyed by a crime they hadn't committed, and the world continued to view them with suspicion despite the lack of evidence. The acquittal had cleared their names in the eyes of the law, but in the court of public opinion, they remained guilty. Even with the acquittal, the case remained unsolved. The Talwars had spent years in a legal battle, but the identity of their daughter's killer remained elusive. There were no new developments, no breakthroughs. The investigation that had begun with such promise had ended in a deadlock. The police, still under intense scrutiny, had failed to close the case. The Talwars had been cleared, but the killer, if it wasn't them, was still out there free. As the years went by, the public fascination with the case didn't wane. New theories emerged. Some said it was a botched robbery. Others believed it was a crime of passion, perhaps involving someone from the household. The theories were endless, but none of them came close to providing the truth. And so the mystery lingered, hanging in the air like an unsolved puzzle. Over time, the media's obsession with the case died down. The Talwars had largely retreated from the public eye, no longer willing to engage with a media that had vilified them for so long. The court of public opinion had long since passed judgment, and for many, the case was closed. But for the Talwars, the pain continued. How could they ever find peace, knowing that their daughter's killer had never been caught? They had spent years trying to rebuild their shattered lives, but they were forever marked by the tragedy. No matter how many years passed, no matter how much time had passed since the acquittal, the questions remained. Who killed Aarushi, and why? The case had gone cold, but the story didn't end with the Talwars' acquittal. In the years following, new investigations were launched, and the media began to examine the case once again. There were renewed calls for a thorough review of the investigation. How had the police allowed such a monumental error to happen? Why had they rushed to judgment so quickly, so definitively? Why had they blamed the parents without ever having concrete evidence to do so? The flaws in the investigation were glaring. The crime scene had been compromised from the start. Evidence had been mishandled, and the police had failed to conduct a thorough and methodical search for clues. The case had been rushed, and it had shown. The Talwars had been wrongfully accused, and the real killer had slipped through the cracks as new information surfaced. The case was revisited. Some investigators suggested that the crime may have been committed by an outsider, someone who had entered the house and carried out the murders. This theory gained traction, but it too remained inconclusive. The investigation was reopened, but as the years dragged on, it became clear that the truth was still beyond reach. The murder of Aarushi Talwar and Hemraj Banjade remains a case that continues to defy resolution. The questions are as haunting as they were the day the bodies were discovered. What happened that night in the Talwar house? Who had the motive, the opportunity, and the means to carry out such a horrific crime? The answers are still unknown. In the years that have passed, the case has become a symbol of how easily justice can be derailed. It's a story of a family torn apart by a crime they did not commit, a justice system that failed them, and a media that was all too eager to condemn. The Talwars may have been acquitted, but the stain of the accusations will never leave them. The death of Aarushi and Hemraj remains one of the most perplexing mysteries in India's criminal history. It is a case that shows how fragile the pursuit of justice can be. The story of Aarushi Talwar is not just a tragedy about a girl's life cut short. It is a warning about the dangers of hasty conclusions, the failures of an investigative system, and the price of being caught in the court of public opinion. Years later, the Talwars continue to carry the weight of a tragedy that is far from over. The killer remains at large, and the questions linger unanswered. In the end, the case of Aarushi Talwar is not just about one family's loss, but about the larger, darker issues within India's criminal justice system. It's a reminder that sometimes the pursuit of justice can be as flawed as the system that's supposed to deliver it. The truth may have been hidden in plain sight all along, but who will ever truly know? And so the mystery remains. The case of Aarushi Talwar and Hemraj Banjade, once so full of hope for justice, has become a symbol of what happens when justice fails, when the wrong people are blamed, and when the real killer is never brought to account.